some light philosophy for the rest of the afternoon. I think that policy didn't get enough of a round of applause when it was mentioned. So I want to, because I do think we've heard it from so many different panelists today, right? I mean, Melinda Gates said it. I mean, we've heard a lot of people say here today that policy is at the root of a lot of the change that we have to make. So I'm particularly pleased that the next panel will touch quite a bit on that. I'd like to invite the president of the Council of Foreign Relations, Mr. Mike Froman to the stage, along with his very closely tied to politics guests. Thank you, welcome, hi.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, welcome.
Terrific, great to see all of you this afternoon. It's great to be back at the Mastercard Global Inclusive Growth Summit. I have to say, there are conferences going on all over town. There's this little thing going on at the IMF and the World Bank. This is clearly the place to be. This is the best conference, the best array of people. You know, there's a lot going on in the world, including wars, rivalries, transnational issues. Sometimes in that process, we focus on Ukraine, we focus on the Middle East, we focus on China. Sometimes we don't pay enough attention to the rest of the world, the emerging markets and developing countries. So this is a great opportunity to talk about where's the future growth going to come from. And let me start with Anantha from India. You've just completed the G20 presidency in India. It was very successful. It really gave India an opportunity both to show off its own success and to lead the rest of the world in a very positive direction. By some measure, this is really India's time. You've had amazing growth. And still, you've written about how there are these islands within India that have not yet been included, have fallen behind. How do you think about inclusive growth, even while you're seeing a lot of top-line success, making sure that that success is broadly shared?
Thank you, Mike, and it's good to be here. First of all, let me say that growth, by definition, is inclusive. And I'm not saying it just to wake up people from the afternoon stupor, because while growth per se may not be necessarily inclusive, but without growth, there cannot be inclusion, because you can't distribute nothing. So in that sense, we do have to ensure that for all developing countries, especially since we have fallen behind on the trend growth post-COVID, we do need to catch up on growth. But given the state of the world and the lack of growth certainties in the developed world, we all have to rely on domestic drivers of growth. And that means bringing, as you said, bringing more people who have been outside the economic activity into the center. And that includes women, micro and small enterprises, and focusing on their education, health, and skilling. These will be the more important drivers of growth going forward, and that will achieve two purposes: ensure sustained growth and also sustainable and inclusive growth.
When you look at your G20 presidency, and now you've handed the baton to Brazil, what do you hope will be taken forward by Brazil and the future G20 presidents? What do you expect of India's agenda to be part of the permanent global agenda?
Sure, I think two key agenda items, and I don't want to give a long list. One is, of course, the issue of MDB reforms to make sure that there is adequate resources available for developing countries to undertake the energy transition. And the second area of importance for current presidency and beyond is addressing the debt vulnerability of developing countries, low-income countries. And we all know that addressing debt requires economic growth. So it is lack of growth and lack of revenues for the government and for the private sector that creates debt burdens to accumulate. So I think if these two priorities we are able to show progress, then it will also give G20 considerable legitimacy.
And you're here at the IMF World Bank meetings. Do you expect there to be any progress on debt restructuring?
Well, there have been progress on debt restructuring, but it can be better. Zambia, we have had, Sri Lanka, we have had, but we also had setback on Ghana, etc. But I think in terms of information sharing, transparency of data, so that all people are on the same board, same level, all those things are happening. But I think there is a need to make sure that before we even address debt vulnerabilities, we also need to make sure that these situations don't arise before we think of addressing them. So what are the guardrails not just for borrowers? What are the guardrails we need to place even on lenders such that in boom times, everybody borrows indiscriminately and everybody lends indiscriminately, and then when the growth rates dry up, it is the borrowing countries that end up facing the music with consequences for the poor people among the population. So we need to think of not just addressing debt problems after they arise, but work on mechanisms by which we can ensure that they don't arise through early warning signals, through sort of automatic barriers for further lending when they cross a particular threshold, in which case the information sharing has to be a lot more than what it is today.
We're going to get to a lender here in a minute, but before we do, let me go to Lisa. You are the shadow, meaning Labour Secretary for International Development in the UK. UK's always punched above its weight when it came to development. Always had a pretty strong commitment, regardless of party in power. What do you expect to change in the UK's development policy if Labour wins the next election? And in particular, how do you see the challenge of addressing both the climate change imperative and continuing on the process of poverty alleviation?
Yeah, well, I mean, thanks very much. We do have a proud record of investing in international development and cooperation in the UK, but we did briefly have a very big hiatus in that a few years ago when we abolished our Department for International Development, folded it into the Foreign Office, and cut many of the programs that the poorest people in the world relied on, leaving many of our partners and allies to pick up the slack at a time when their domestic economies were contracting. We abandoned the commitment to 0.7, and so all of these things are things that the next Labour government will work towards restoring, repairing and rebuilding a reputation as a long-term reliable partner again. But last time we were in office, we established the Department for International Development. We did huge amounts of work with many of the people in this room in order to partner to create better lives and conditions for people all over the world and put climate change on the agenda through our leadership in the G8 and G7. We recognise, though, that this is not 1997, the last time we took office, and the world has changed, and so must we. So in 4 key ways. The first is that last time we were in office, our economy was growing. It was twice the size of China's, which is hard to believe now. We were members of the European Union, and multilateralism was in the ascendancy. I think none of those things are quite true anymore. And so recognising the very significant challenges that we're going to inherit, we are keen to be far more strategic about where Britain can play the most outsized role. And it follows on very nicely from India's leadership in the G20, because we believe that the greatest challenge in this field right now is the triple challenge that many middle and low income countries face of climate change, poverty and debt. I've just come back from Zambia, where a very progressive president is trying to break that cycle, invest in his own people and long-term economic development, but is consistently hindered by the fact that the vast majority of national income is spent on servicing debt, and the rules and systems prevent rapid change. And we believe that as the UK, home to the City of London, private finance banks, insurers in particular, and the legal jurisdiction where many of those debts are settled, as well as with a very privileged position to be on the board of the IMF, the World Bank and many other major institutions, that we have an obligation to play a leadership role in helping to reform those global systems so that fresh democracies can get quick wins and we can allow people to deliver on their own ambitions. And alongside that, we think that it's time that the UK delivered on our commitment to do more through multilateralism. Multilateralism has been under significant strain, but if we want to leverage the funding that currently exists, and our aid budget is still a significant budget, but it pales in comparison to the scale of the challenge, then we need to do far more work through multilateral institutions and in partnership with others. We believe that the world has changed too in one very significant way, and that is the way we go about approaching what's traditionally been called aid, although we would call it long-term economic growth, inclusive growth, aptly titled for this summit. And that is that Countries around the world, particularly across the global south, have left us in no doubt that they don't want Western partners to come in and save them. They want Western partners who come in and walk alongside. I have met some of the most creative, interesting, thoughtful people that I've ever worked with in my life, whether it's people sitting at the top levels of government and business and finance, or whether it's the young engineer I met in Ghana, who was the first girl in her village, the only girl in her village to finish secondary school because the lack of wash facilities meant most girls had to drop out during puberty, who went on to qualify as an engineer and is now transforming the lives and economic prospects of young women in Ghana who come after her. These are the people that inspire me every single day, and I think together we can form a partnership that will genuinely change the world.
Quick question, quick answer. Time for applause. Okay. Is there a trade-off between addressing climate change and alleviating poverty?
I think that they're one and the same thing right now. And actually we have to be able to, I think the Americans have this phrase for our American colleagues, walk and chew gum at the same time. I was with Mia Mottley yesterday, who many of you will know, the Prime Minister of Barbados, talking about the Bridgetown agenda. You know, there are a number of things we have to do all at the same time. We have to enable countries to deal with their debt issues so that they can very quickly invest in people in their own countries, so that they can live the richer, larger, more dignified lives that they deserve. Governments need to be able to show that this is an agenda that takes people with them, that doesn't involve trade-offs for people. We have to deal with the finance issues that mean that we get investable propositions over the line and far more private finance into countries where, you know, many countries across Africa where 90% of the finance that goes in comes from public bodies. That's never going to solve the problem. So we've got to deal with all these things at once, and we've got to do it. Why? Because it's a moral obligation, but we've also got to do it because these are common goods that we're squandering, public goods, and we need to work together to solve some of the world's greatest challenges, or we all lose.
That's a great segue to Jose. Public-private financing. Public financing inherently going to be limited, not anywhere near the scale to deal with climate change, poverty alleviation, education, health, all the other issues. What role can the private sector play? What role can the markets play? And where do you see it having the biggest impact? And then while you're here in Washington for these meetings, is there more that the World Bank in particular, probably more than the IMF, could be doing to make it easier for the private sector to invest in these sorts of projects?
Yeah, thank you very much. And you know, after these such inspiring interventions, it's really difficult to say something which matches those. So thank you very much for these fantastic comments. So the private sector. I firmly believe, and I think that this is shared by many of my colleagues in the private sector, that there is a fundamental alignment between the right thing to do and the smart thing to do from the business point of view. And I think that this is one such case. While we're discussing here in Washington what can be done in order to solve the world's problems, it's clear that these global challenges need collective action. So we need to come all of us together, because the purses of the public sector have been depleted as a result of the many issues that have happened in the world of the last few years. Public debt levels have increased very significantly. So there is a need for the private sector to step up. And the private sector is never going to be in the lead. The lead is something that corresponds to governments. Governments have to, you know, there are policy priorities that need to be defined. But the private sector is a fundamental contributor to scaling up the finance which is needed to combat climate change in terms of mitigation and adaptation, and also to deliver on the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, Standard Chartered is a global bank with a strong footprint in emerging markets throughout Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. And our role is being a connector bank, a bridge bank, connecting advanced economies, international financial centers with where the money is needed. Where the money is, where the money is needed. And what we find is that the concept of private-public partnership is absolutely of the essence. And there are two words that to me are as close to a silver bullet as you can be for solving these issues, which is blended finance. Now, we do a lot of blended finance. We may be one of the banks in the world who do more of that in emerging markets and developing economies. But we do it episodically. We do a project here, a project there. We bring the government along. We bring multilaterals along. We make a project bankable. We bring international investors. We deliver. What we need is scale and speed. So we need to think of platforms, of ideas. We scale up the provision of a blended finance, and that will require two things. First, the reform of the multilaterals, and particularly of the World Bank and other multilateral development banks. They need to work with business models that maximize impact, and I think that this is the direction of travel, which fortunately is being followed, so tick. They need to put the balance sheet at use so that they don't maximize lending, but they maximize the amount of money that can be leveraged as a result of that, including the private sector. And for the private sector to come in, incentives are key. And I, as an economist, I believe, and now a banker, I believe in incentives. If you have a mouse and you have the cheese, if the cheese is here, the mouse goes there. If the cheese is there, the mouse goes there. So you need to change the position of the cheese.
Isn't there a book about moving my cheese or
Absolutely.
something? That's a different issue.
So
Okay.
you need to change the position of the cheese, and you need to make those projects attractive on a risk-adjusted basis. So you need the role of guarantees. I'm not saying that the private sector should be bailed out. It's not that. It's making sure that the projects are bankable. They're appropriately de-risked. There is a scaling up in the use of guarantees by the multilaterals so that you can go to multipliers which go from 1/4 to 5 or 10. That's what you need in terms of $1 of public money leveraging 5 or 10 times more private money. If we do that, we'll have a chance. If not, we'll be doomed. But I'm positive.
Is investing, that's good, investing in the green transition, the energy transition, is it good for business? Is it good for your shareholders?
I'll tell you one thing. We have committed in terms of our environmental sort of objectives to mobilize over $300 billion of sustainable finance, very clearly defined, transparent, to avoid greenwashing concerns, between 21 and 2030. That means delivering $30 billion per year. Now, are we walking the talk? 2021, 30 billion delivered. 2022, 30 billion delivered. Same thing, 2023. $90 billion. We are on track. Return accretive, good business, helping the world.
You're allowed to overperform too, right?
But
It's okay. I think I remember from business. It's okay.
Yes,
You budget for 30, you do 35, right?
But the thing is that the idea was we couldn't do that immediately. So the idea was start smaller and grow bigger. But we're already on track, and then we will do more.
I have to say, I run a think tank. We have our own convenings. I've been at convenings all over town this week. This is the most optimistic convening I have been to. Let me thank our panelists for their contribution.